Okay. The topic for tonight is the Bodhisattva Path. And we're studying loosely Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, a book by Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who started the Shambhala tradition, and edited by John Baker as well. So by a show of hands, who's heard of the term Bodhisattva before? Okay. So, it's funny. I think the Bodhisattva, if you were to choose a Western analog, would probably be a saint, right? There's some aspect of that. And I don't want to make too close of a comparison, but there's an idea of selflessness, and there's an idea of giving and helping people without necessarily an expectation of return. And those things are shared between, I think, the idea of saints and bodhisattvas. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk a little bit. I'm going to read some highlights of the Bodhisattva Path from this book, from this chapter. And then I also want to supplement it with a little bit of some other writings of Chögyam Trungpa on the Bodhisattva Path. And then we can just talk about it, what it means. So one of the things that he says, being aware of a situation on a small scale also brings awareness on a larger scale. Out of this develops panoramic awareness called Maha Vipassana. Vipassana is part of what we just did. Vipassana being an awareness of the space. So when we were meditating, we were focusing our attention on things, whether it was our hearing or our body. We used what we would call shamatha, which is a point of focus on one of our senses to kind of help us relax into the present, right? I don't know if you guys had that experience, but by sitting here and focusing on the present through our senses, it helps us relax as well. And the more relaxed we become, the more aware we can become of what's going on, not just with our specific point of focus, whether that's our hearing in the case of the meditation we just did, or it could be the most common point of focus is the breath in meditation, which I actually didn't talk about very much. But these things are, because the breath is always happening in the present, it's a great way to anchor us to the present. And that anchoring of the present and the relaxation that comes with that concentration really helps us develop our awareness. It really helps open our awareness. So instead of being constantly worried about what we are going to do in the future, or what we did in the past, or by constantly worrying about like judging things or thinking about what's going on, we actually are learning to let go of this constant anxious thought that we have, and just kind of rest in the present. One of my favorite ways of putting it is we're learning to relax into the present. And it's a little different. That relaxation and that awareness is a little bit different from a focus on the present. You could be snowboarding and be very focused on the present, because if you don't, you're going to fall. You're going to hurt yourself, right? And you can say that, I like to say it's like snowboarding, skiing, playing a sport, whatever it is a very meditative act, right? It's a very meditative endeavor, but it is not meditation. That act of meditation is sort of working with our mind to constantly bring our attention back to the present. And we do that through the shamatha of focus, of concentration, and the vipassana of the awareness that comes with that we develop the awareness, and we kind of build upon the focus on the shamatha. And so what he's talking about here, this being aware of a situation on a small scale also helps awareness on a larger scale. And out of this develops panoramic awareness, or Maha Vipassana. Maha meaning great, and Vipassana being this kind of awareness. And the reason that that's important is like when we sit and you first start learning to meditate, whether you're a long-time meditator or you're just starting, right? You sit and you meditate, and you're training your brain to be aware of what's going on in the moment. And one of the great things, that happens is as we constantly train our minds to notice when we're distracted and we're thinking about something else, and to come back to the present, is not only do we make ourselves aware of what we're hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, touching in the present, but we also start to learn how hard it is to keep our minds focused on the present. We also start to become familiar with what's going on in our heads, right? With what our mind is doing. And that familiarity with what our minds are doing and how much of the time we are not present with what's going on right now is very key to understanding not just how we work and how our minds work, but also understanding how everybody's minds work. And that link between what happens in our minds and how our minds operate and how we interact with the world is key to understanding how other people work and how they're interacting with the world. And quite frankly, in really just seeing clearly what's going on in any given moment, particularly when you're interacting with the world or interacting with another person. This act of meditation is constantly teaching us how we interact with things, and that understanding is key to the development of compassion and something that the Buddhists would call skillful means, which is, there's a lot of different applications to skillful means, but the interaction between people is a big part of it. And so this idea that being aware of something on a small scale, helping you with the larger scale, is really key. And it's the link between the personal and everything else, in a way. And he goes on to say, that is awareness of the overall pattern rather than the focusing of attention upon details, right? So when we're noticing that our mind wanders, it's not, maybe you notice what the specific thought is, but when you notice that your mind's wandered 10 times in the last 5 minutes, then you start to notice the pattern of what your mind is doing. We begin to see the pattern of our fantasies rather than being immersed in them. We discover that we need not struggle with our projections, that the wall that separates us from them is our own creation. The insight into the insubstantial nature of ego is prajna, transcendental knowledge, also translated as wisdom. As we glimpse prajna, we relax, realizing that we no longer have to maintain the existence of ego. We can afford to be open and generous. Seeing another way of dealing with our projections brings intense joy. This is the first spiritual level of attainment of the Bodhisattva, the first bhumi. We enter the Bodhisattva Path, the Mahayana Path, the open way, the path of warmth and openness. So, I'm going to continue. Bodhisattva means, he talks about the definition of bodhisattva. He who is brave enough to walk on the path of the Bodhi. Bodhi means awake, the awakened state. This is not to say that the bodhisattva must already be fully awake, but he is willing to walk the path of the awakened ones. That's important, right? So it's not saying you have to be like a real, fully realized Buddha to be a bodhisattva. Maybe you don't have to be fully realized to actually walk the path, to intend to do what the bodhisattva vows to do. And we'll get more into that. This path consists of 6 transcendental activities which take place spontaneously. They are transcendental generosity, discipline, patience, energy, meditation, and knowledge, otherwise known as the 6 paramitas or the 6 perfections or the 6 transcendent perfections. So paramita actually means arriving on the other side of the shore, which is sort of the technical definition. But I think the idea is that these paramitas help us attain, really it's the awareness and compassion that comes with the Bodhisattva path and really the Buddhist path in general. The Bodhisattva is not trying to be good or kind, but he is spontaneously compassionate. That's important. So the Bodhisattva is not trying to be good or kind, but just spontaneously compassionate. The thing that's really interesting as we practice meditation and we get more aware of how our minds work and what's happening in the present is there's a great wisdom and a great warmth in the present. And compassion actually happens spontaneously the more present that you are. And part of that is because you become more adept in seeing what is actually happening and reacting to it in a skillful way. A gross version of this is just like when you're riding the subway, and if you've ever ridden the subway or you're driving in a car and you miss your exit or you miss your stop. You didn't miss your stop because you were present of your surroundings and what's going on. You missed your stop or your exit because you were totally lost in thought about something else, right? And so in a way, you're not acting very skillfully, you're not interacting with the world appropriately if you missed your stop, right? This is also a metaphor and true for our interactions with people on a day-to-day basis in every moment of our lives, right? A more specific example could be you're at a grocery store and you are checking out. You have some food. You're buying food. I don't know about you guys, but a lot of times I'm in line. I'm on my phone. I'm like checking the phone out, and there are times when I don't even really make eye contact with the person. I won't even like necessarily acknowledge the existence of that person. Not because I'm trying to be, mean or an asshole or like ignoring their existence, but because I'm just not present with what's going on. And what's going on is that I'm actually having still typically a human interaction with the person that's helping me check out my groceries. That's another example, maybe a little closer to what we're talking about, of where we have, it's very easy not to be present. It's very easy to miss out on our interaction with the world around us. We're very focused on one thing, our phone or whatever our thought in our head is, but we're not focused on the person that's checking us out. And how are they, right? I don't know if you've ever noticed, but a lot of times people are doing the same thing on the other side of that interaction, right? And sometimes if you do pay attention to the people around you, sometimes you notice things like, oh, this person looks really miserable right now, or this person looks really happy. And you can miss all that if you're not present, if you're not there to see it. So what we're learning, this is all the same thing. We're learning to be present, because when we are present, it allows us to see what's going on, and then it allows us to have a choice about the way in which we interact. And I guarantee you that if you do this tomorrow, whatever it is, whether it's a cabbie or checking out at a grocery store or somebody at work that maybe there's a receptionist at work or somebody that you kind of say hello to and you walk by. Maybe if a great practice would be to just say, hey, you don't have to change your interaction, but just be aware, just make yourself aware of the person that you are interacting with, rather than being a cursory thing. Make it a genuine thing. Hi, how are you? How's your day? I would suggest to you that this is the act of a bodhisattva, right? This is bodhisattva. It can be in the little things. It doesn't have to be that you give up all your possessions, you move to Calcutta and you work with homeless children. Okay? Also, totally acceptable act of a bodhisattva. But but not necessary to actually make the world a better place. Not necessary to just improve or interact with the universe skillfully. Let me continue. So with the 6 paramitas, generosity. We'll go through them. Generosity. Generosity is a willingness to give, to open without philosophical or pious or religious motives, just simply doing what is required at any moment in any situation, not being afraid to receive anything. The 6 paramitas all go together, and generosity is kind of what the Western notion of generosity is. The important thing, one of the important aspects, is the idea that we're not trying to do something so we can get something back in return. We're doing something because it's the right thing to do. It's because it's what feels right. It's because we're interacting skillfully with the world. He talks about a surrendering with generosity. It's giving up of the ego. It's giving up of the wants and what I want out of the situation. And it's really focusing more on what is needed in the situation. And again, it can be something as small as like an interaction with somebody that you don't know, holding a door or saying hello or just being aware of a situation. Maybe somebody needs help with the door because they're carrying a baby with a carriage, which I am now much more sensitive to now that I have a 10-month-old. Yeah, it's amazing. The next one, discipline. Discipline is an interesting translation. The way that Chögyam Trungpa talks about discipline, it's really not discipline in the sense that we think of it. These are the things that help us on the Bodhisattva path, help us on the Buddhist path, really. But discipline it's almost like the discipline not to be rigid. And by that I mean that a lot of times when we go through our life, we like to create parameters and a set series of rules that we follow as we go through our days, right? These rules can be as big as like the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, right? That's a big set of, very big and generally agreed to set of rules. But they can also be rules that have to do with kind of supporting our ideas of ourself or going through our day and being like, well, I'm the kind of person who, doesn't tip generously unless it's deserved. My cabbies have to be really nice, or my servers have to really go above and beyond for me to give more than my 15%. There's no judgment in this, but I'm just saying it can be little rules or big rules. And one of the interesting things I always come back to with the idea of imposing rules. This is like the classic philosophical moral question, right? If that, one of the 10 Commandments, I guess is a religious question, really. One of the 10 Commandments is thou shalt not steal. Okay? But if your family's starving and you steal a loaf of bread to feed your family, is that wrong? Right? We've probably all heard this in one form or another. To me, this is actually, it's actually not a philosophical question. It is, but the amazing thing about that question is what it does is points out the flaws in having a predetermined set of rules that you follow all the time, because they don't work all the time. They don't work in every situation. The idea with discipline in the paramitas is that discipline is not following rules or guidelines or a preconceived notion or structure, and actually committing to interacting with the present as it is, and without those ideas, without the labels, and without the like, this is bad and this is good in all situations, so this must be bad. I would suggest to you that a lot of people, all of us, but some people more than others, get into a lot of trouble in their lives because they're rigid, because they rigidly stick to ideas about what is right and what is wrong, and they're not able to let go of those ideas long enough to deal with what is right in front of them at any given time. Patience. The next act of the Bodhisattva, the next paramita, is patience. Actually, you cannot really divide the 6 activities of the Bodhisattva into strictly separate practices. One leads into and embodies the next. That's just sort of to say that these things all go together. Patience also involves skillful means, which we're discussing. As with discipline and generosity, patience never expects anything. Patience and skillful means is, again, this idea is related to what we were just saying, right? So patience is the not rushing to judgment, really, right? Patience is allowing yourself to say, okay, let's just evaluate the situation in a way, right? Let's not just rush and decide that, react. But let's see what is actually going on in this situation. And again, these are big situations and little situations. It doesn't need to be like a life or death situation. It could be, patience with, what am I about to eat? Am I mindful? Am I aware about what I'm going to eat for my meal? Is that going to be good for me? Is that going to be bad for me? Is it like, should I be eating something else? That could be like taking the time to not just be like, well, I wake up in the morning and I really want sugar. I really want pancakes, so I'm going to have pancakes. It's not that it's good or bad, but having the patience to just look at the situation clearly is important. The next is energy. And this paramita, the energy is joy. And I think that the idea here is just that when you are present with things, there's a great deal of there's a joy and an enjoyment and in the present moment that can be found. There's energy that comes with being present because you are patient and because you are not worried about whatever your agenda is in your head. You're just being with the present and whoever is in the present and whatever is in the present. The next one is meditation. Meditation is interesting. Meditation in this context is basically awareness, which we were talking about a little bit before, right? That sense of vipassana, although he doesn't use that term. He says, where because of his compassionate energy, the Bodhisattva experiences continual panoramic awareness, that maha-vipassana. So that's just how it's sort of like, the awareness is key to being able to see things clearly and interact with them in a skillful way. The last is knowledge, and this is called prajna, which can be translated as transcendental knowledge or wisdom. I think wisdom is like a little less, sounds a little more, I don't know, kind of normal to me. a little less frou-frou-y. But there's good reasons to call it transcendental knowledge, I'm sure. So that is kind of, those are the paramitas. Well, let me just read this part. Sorry about prajna because it's good. It's hard. Like so much of this book is great that it's hard not to read the whole thing, right? The Bodhisattva transmutes the watcher or ego into discriminating knowledge, prajna paramita. Pra means super. Na means knowledge, knowing rather. Super knowledge. Complete, accurate knowledge which sees everything. Consciousness fixed on this and that has been cut through, which produces the twofold knowledge, the prajna of knowing and the prajna of seeing. The prajna of knowing deals with the emotions, is cutting through the conflicting emotions, the attitudes that one has towards oneself. thereby revealing what one is. The prajna of seeing is the transcendence of primitive preconceptions of the world. It is seeing situations as they are. Therefore, the prajna of seeing allows for dealing with situations in as balanced a way as possible. Meditation is not merely awareness practice alone, because you only practice awareness, and then you do not develop the intuitive insight necessary to expand your practice. Then you have to shift awareness from one subject to another. Developing prajna is like learning to walk. You might have to begin by developing awareness of just one thing, and then develop awareness of two things, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. But finally, if you are to walk properly, you must learn to expand your awareness to include the entire situation you are in, so that there is one awareness of everything in the same situation. In order to do this, it is necessary not to dwell on anything. Then you are aware of everything. And I really like that, because it talks about what we started talking about, right? So when we started with the meditation, we were focusing first on our bodies and then on our hearing, right? It's like it incorporates everything. So how are we aware of the present? We're aware of the present through our senses, through our experiences of the world, are through our senses and through our mind. Those are the only ways that we experience the world. I mean, you could say energetically, maybe, right? And the also when we sit and we're talking, not dwelling on things, what do we do when we meditate? We notice when we are dwelling on or focused in on our thoughts that don't have anything to do with the present, and we let those go and we come back to the present. This is what allows for prajna, allows for wisdom, and the awareness, the wisdom that comes with awareness. We can't be wise and aware and awake if we are lost in thought about something that doesn't have to do with what's happening right now. Makes sense, right? So that is, the majority of the stuff from the book. There's one other thing I wanted to read that before doing the talk tonight, I just Googled Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche and Bodhisattva Path, and I came up with an article that was a little different. I would guess that it was written after this, it didn't say what it was from. I forget what book it was from, but let me just read a couple of things and then we can chat about it. Taking a bodhisattva vow. Yeah, this is about actually now. These are what we've just done. We've talked about the paramitas, these things that help us. They're sort of like guideposts to the path of the bodhisattva, right? These are the things that help us along the bodhisattva path. And this is talking about actually, what do we do when we become a bodhisattva, when we walk the path. Taking a bodhisattva vow means that we are inspired to put the teachings of Buddhism into practice in our everyday lives. In doing so, we are mature enough not to hold anything back. Our talents are not rejected, but are utilized as part of the learning process, part of the practice. A bodhisattva may teach Dharma in the form of intellectual understanding, artistic understanding, or even business understanding. So in committing ourselves to the Bodhisattva path, we are resuming our talents in an enlightened way, not being threatened or confused by them. He goes on to say we're helping others without getting ego credits, right? That expectation of not necessarily of doing things because it's what needs to be done or should be done, not because you're trying to get something out of it. The point of taking the bodhisattva vow is not to convert people to our particular view. Necessarily, the idea is that we should contribute something to the world simply by our own way of relating, by our own gentleness. And then he goes on to talk a little bit more. But so I think that's, again, he's really talking about the same thing that we were just talking about, but it's this idea of, it's a selfless thing, it's an egoless thing. And I don't know if anybody's ever had this kind of debate. I studied philosophy in college, so I really enjoyed debating all ideas like altruism. But I'll never forget, I was in a high school religion class. I can't remember the name of my professor. Actually, maybe I do. But anyway, so I'm in a high school religion class, and we're talking about the concept of altruism, and we brought up, Mother Teresa as being a good example of an altruistic person. And I remember at the time, I was like, I was kind of maybe alone in the class. It was a small class, like 12 people. And I was like, hey, I don't know if I believe in altruism, because I feel like, Mother Teresa probably, got something out of her work. She probably did it because it made her feel better in some ways. It made, and if something that you're doing is making you feel better, is that really genuinely altruistic? Or are you actually kind of getting something out of what you're doing? And he really didn't like that. I will not forget it. We argued about it for a while. He did not like it at all. But what's really interesting to me when you take that idea of altruism or of being generous to somebody, and then you talk about what he's talking about here, which is not getting anything out of it, doing something because it is the appropriate action in that moment. There's two aspects to that. One thing is that in the present, there is this enormous ability to access compassion. Compassion seems to be some inherent part of being present, particularly with other beings. But then on top of that, there's almost a sense in this book and in Chögyam Trungpa's writings that these kinds of compassionate actions that could be taken care of homeless children in Calcutta is born not out of a desire to actually get something out of it. It's actually just what the moment calls for, and it doesn't have to do with our ego and thinking, well, if I do this, I'm gonna do a good thing. I'm gonna be a better person for doing this, or that person's gonna feel good, and it makes me feel good to make other people feel good, and that may be true, but there's a subtle thing that has to do with that skillful interaction with the present and seeing things for how they are, and a natural compassion that arises in the present. And when you feel that, when you experience that, if you leave your ideas about who you are and what's good and what's bad, and you just are present, then compassionate action is like the natural thing to do. And that is really interesting to me, and I think subtly maybe a little different in terms of the way the Buddhists look at this or talk about it. You're not necessarily doing God's work. You're not doing it because it's the right thing to do. You're doing it because there's no other action that makes sense in that moment. And I think that maybe if altruism exists, it exists in that way. So, yeah, that was probably my biggest thing from reading this for the second time, because I actually taught this chapter 2 years ago when we were first going through this book here, and I think that was the thing that struck me the most, There's this idea that compassionate action of a bodhisattva is really, it's almost like it's there waiting to be done, as opposed to something that we feel, that we got to do because it's the right thing. So with that, certainly I would be open to questions if you guys have questions. And I also want to maybe do, so we have a few minutes left. Maybe we'll take a little bit of time to actually just think about, my question would be is, have you ever experienced or seen or done something where someone was trying to make the world a better place or trying to help someone, but it was there was an ego-driven aspect to it, and how did that work out? Right? Have you ever seen somebody try to help somebody else, but maybe there was a selfish component to that, a non-selfless act of trying to help someone else, and what was the result? So if you want to either think about that or ask a question, I'm totally open to comments or questions. And actually, if you wouldn't mind that black mic right there, if you hold the bottom of it for a minute, and it'll go green, and then it should, here you go. And then if you can use the mic, that would be great for the benefit of people, for the video, people watching their home. We actually had somebody from Australia who was asking for the video, so we're trying to do it. Arthur, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for coming down.
My pleasure. This is really great. I guess there may not be exactly questions, but I had 3 things that came to mind, and maybe if you wanted to comment on them.
Yeah.
The first thing was when you were talking about focusing on other people. There's something, I think the hard thing we all face is that there's a conflict sometimes. If you take the time to say hi to the person in the hallway or really focus on them, then, the thing that you're thinking about or the big task that that's really important to your boss or your team or other people who have an interest in what you're doing, you kind of feel like you might be giving something up in terms of your focus. And I think that's inherently hard. And I think I also thought of one thing that distracts me sometimes when I'm on the checkout line is I'm texting with my girlfriend. And if I'm not thinking about her being responsive in that moment, I might be, not doing right by her. I think it made me think one of the hardest things is actually a broader task of setting up your life so that you have the right kinds of relationships and that you manage those relationships kind of long term, and you manage your energy and your focus so that you're able to do those things and not having to be hyper-focused on this one thing and then seem like a jerk to the person you walk by in the hallway, or just not even have a relationship with that person, or kind of disregard them in a way that might not be exactly the right thing. And that also just made me generally think, which is kind of a second separate comment, that sometimes focus or lack of focus is not necessarily not about what's in the present, but like an overinvestment in one thing versus another thing, an overinvestment in the thing that's stressing you out the most. And so it might be very present, very much about what you're doing right now, but you spend 100% too much time on that thing, and then you forget about something else or forget about other people. And then just finally comment on Mother Teresa and selflessness. I think I similarly had, I really felt I sort of puzzled over that in high school or college. And I think as you get older, there's one thing that's there's something, I think the theme in here is that there's something very practical about all of these practices, really, really literally practical. Almost going beyond spiritual, and so practically, I think what I've developed more of a sense as an adult that I know when somebody is like in it for them, even if they've got because you've met people who've done amazing things in the world. You see someone speak at an event and they've done these amazing things, and then you actually meet them in person, they seem like they don't have any regard for the people around them. Sometimes they're ego-driven, selfless people in a certain way, and somebody who has only really influenced maybe the people around them, you can also meet that person and see their attitude towards, and that's the practical thing, their attitude towards the things that they do and how they interact with the world around them, and you can tell that they're not driven by like an overweening sense of ego, or an even averagely overweening sense of ego, but they really are kind of like an inherently good person, the kind of person that you feel like, wow, I would really like to be more like that person. I'm not sure I know how. I personally, sometimes feel like I am way too driven by ego, and was very interested in your talk because of that. But you meet people and you say, wow, that person really seems to like have the right attitude towards the people around them, and really I came away from an interaction with that person, or I often come away from interactions with that person just feeling like they've got it. They've really got they're in it for the right reasons.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff they bring up, but I think you're asking those are the right questions, right? And I think if you start with like taking the example of you're at the checkout counter, there's a person that's checking you out that you may or may not be aware of. You're texting with your partner, and maybe there's something going on that's sort of intense. I mean, I have this actually problem all the time because I'm texting with like people at work, and my wife is like, CT. I'm like, I'm just in a conversation, right? It feels like a conversation. It's just a text conversation, and I think the important thing is, right, it's hard to generalize, right? You shouldn't generalize about it. You shouldn't say, well, you always want to make sure you take care of the person that is, that is your closest to you, or anything like that. The idea is that in each situation, every situation is unique, and that you need to be present enough to recognize the effect that you're having on the world, whether it's because you're texting with somebody and standing like next to someone, or whatever the case may be. And every situation is going to require a different thing, but the more present you are, the more aware you are, and the less wrapped up you are in stories about, oh man, if I don't text this person back, I'm going to lose this business or whatever, or they're going to be mad at me or whatever. The more you're aware of not just that side of things, and not just the side of the things of like, if it's the person standing next to you as well, but also most importantly aware of where your ego is at in all this, in terms of where your concerns are about yourself and not about the person that you're texting with, and not about the person that you're standing next to. And the more we're able to let go of our own fears and anxieties about how our lives are going to be affected by this, and actually evaluate how the other people's lives are going to be affected by that in that moment, that will allow us to probably make the best decision, right? It's only when we get caught up in the I, me, like what am I going to get out of this situation, or what am I afraid of losing in this situation, that we're actually able to make the best decision. And it's entirely possible that you could be like, right, you could be standing in line texting with your girlfriend or whatever, and the person checking you out is having a horrible day and could really use like a little bit of like a smile and a hello, but the person that you're texting with really needs you to be like replying back like right now, which actually kind of happens, right? Like pauses could be really, really, really problematic in modern technology, So it's like, but that it's like the getting rid of the ego, getting rid of the like, what am I getting out of this situation, and what is most needed, most necessary, is the best way to do that. And it may be that you can't satisfy everyone, but you can still make the best choice available. And that's a big thing. You know, with the, when you're talking about like, you know, people who have done amazing things, and people who become world famous, or like, you know, billionaires, or like, you know, a lot. I mean, I would suggest, you know, probably a lot of spiritual leaders in a lot of cases too. You know, that like a lot of these people, it's very hard to be famous or adulated, like, or super rich or whatever it is, and not have that like affect your ego in essentially a negative way, to the point where it makes it harder for you to relate to the people around you sometimes. And it's funny, they actually did, you know, I'm trying to remember what the study was in, but there was a study that studied millionaires, and which I would assume are sort of these days are multimillionaires, because I feel like being a millionaire is not that life-changing, certainly not in New York. But and what the study postulated that you know, having a lot of money makes you less compassionate. And I would never go so far as to generalize to say that all rich people are not compassionate, but there certainly are aspects that I think when people have a lot of money, that they don't feel they have to deal with things that they don't want to deal with, right? And that can be a challenge to all these to the ego side of things, to letting go of the ego side of things, which is the only way to access compassion, and the only way to access being present, you know, and then interacting skillfully. And it all comes down to kind of the same stuff, right? That letting go of the self, and you know, from a bodhisattva perspective, like interacting with the others. Yeah, for sure.
So maybe that's why Rinpoche brought up the paramitas here, because that's something that's very important to understand. Like generosity is of the virtue that produces peace. Like each paramita has something that, a little saying that goes with it. And so no matter what our circumstances in life is, we can still tune into the virtues of the paramitas to work with the situation.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say we have a lot of money, but we don't want to share. But if we know that generosity is a virtue that produces peace, we think, well, maybe I'll share, you know, because maybe I need some peace or whatever. It has to go beyond the little petty world that we live in. And one of the things about Trungpa Rinpoche was that he was, of course, a great bodhisattva, because he dedicated his whole life to working with his students and teaching the Dharma. And when you were with him, he was very present, but he was also a total lack of aggression. And that was, I think, his real true bodhisattva activity, in that he completely accepted his students from where they were when he met them. That was a real openness, that wherever you are, that's where you start. And so he wasn't judging anyone. And that's a great bodhisattva activity, is not to judge and be open and present and accepting of the situation.
It's essential.
Yeah. And also it could be accepting of yourself, so that when you're really bombarded with a lot of work, like all these multitasking things that we have to do now in order to survive in this world, have a little more bodhisattva activity with the situation that we find ourselves in, this modern world that we live in, and not be so hard on ourselves.
And that goes back to that what we talked about in the beginning, where the little awarenesses kind of help us relate to the bigger awarenesses, right? Awareness of ourself translates into awareness of other people.
Yeah, it used to be a lot easier, I think, when people did retreats in caves, and there was no cell phones and no TV and airline travel and that kind of thing. So it's much more challenging now to be awake.
Well, great stuff to work with.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've been thinking a lot about compassion over the years. It's always been an idea that, as I found challenging to understand. And one of the first things you hear on the Buddhist path is that compassion is not born out of feeling sorry for someone. That's a very misguided form of compassion. And
it's sympathy, not...
I've come to think over the years that, am I speaking loud enough?
Oh. It should change the feedback.
Okay.
It should be better.
That it comes out of awareness, of coming into the present moment, as opposed to being lost in dreams. When one's lost in dreams, you're isolated. You're talking to yourself. One is, and out of touch. You could be so lost in a dream that someone might call your name and you didn't hear it. But when you come back into the kind of meditation practice that you were teaching today, of resting in the space, then you're available. And you're not isolated. And in fact, quite the reverse. I think that then, when one becomes much more connected to the world around one and responsive to it, and that perhaps is the real meaning of compassion on the Bodhisattva path, that the Bodhisattva is so awake in the present that they are constantly being touched and moved and communicated with by everything in the world around them, and that they are responsive to that because they have given up their own dreams, their own agendas. There's another thing I'm still puzzling. I find compassion, the concept in Buddhism, so challenging. At a next level up in the teachings, they talk about reality, in the terms of these three principles, the three bodies of the Buddha. And they're sometimes talked about in other terms, but there are always these three. And the first one is that nothing exists. Nothing has any true existence. Everything is just an appearance that is dissolving and reappearing instantaneously all the time in this present moment, like images in a mirror, like reflections on water. And the second principle is that while nothing has any real solid existence, that nonetheless things appear and they communicate to us what they are. The red of of a rose, the sound of a violin, the taste of sugar or of vinegar. And all these things are communicating through our senses and our minds. And then the third principle, and here it is compassion. And what does that mean? And they talk about, in these terms, they talk about the power, the unobstructed power of compassion to generate things in this present moment, in this space that we live in, this space that things are constantly arising and passing away, and that they call this the unobstructed power of compassion. I mean, isn't that amazing? Such an idea. And I just put it out there because I find it so challenging, so powerful, so provocative, and so beautiful. As a description of what we're standing in the middle of. And the reverse of that, and the sort of the neurosis that keeps us from seeing it, is self-absorption, and being lost in dreams, which certainly I do a lot of. But you come back, when it comes back, the horn goes off, wakes you up, we walk down the streets absorbed in our cell phones, and just oblivious in a way, or not partially oblivious anyhow. So anyhow, those are my reflections on this thing, the Bodhisattva Path. The Bodhisattva. I know I've told this story before, but I met a real Bodhisattva. I feel now. He was a Japanese Zen Buddhist. His name was Koban Chino Sensei. He was just a sensei. Later he became a Roshi. And then later he died in a tragic accident. And I was thinking of him because she brought up Mother Teresa, and one day I had a conversation with him. I took him skiing, and he loved to ski. and I thought he's sort of a normal guy, He just really liked to ski really fast. He was a little out of control. And then afterwards we were sitting around, and we got down to the subject of the Dharma. And I told him, I said, I had the thought of Mother Teresa that you raised earlier, and how she had dedicated her life to the service of others, and here I was, not nearly doing anything quite so generous. And I said to him, maybe, I should be doing something else, something more. And he, suddenly, it was like he transformed, I felt. It was my perception of him. Instead of being just a ski buddy, suddenly he became a Buddhist teacher. And he looked at me and he said, a bodhisattva finishes the conversation with the person sitting across the table. Mm-hmm. He was looking at me across the table. Mm-hmm. That you're open and responsive is the way I understood that. And instead of being caught up in dreams, preconceptions of any kind. So anyhow, those are my thoughts. It's a powerful subject. Thank you.
Thank you
for your treatment.
There's two things I'd like to say to that. One is, I was, so I do, for those of you who don't know, I do real estate during the day. And I was talking to a Buddhist friend of mine who was, I was talking to her about my job, and I'm like, oh, I'm doing real estate. Real estate agents don't get like a great rap and blah, blah, blah. And she was like, and she was like, no, CT, that's good bodhisattva work that you're doing there, And I was like, oh, thanks. You're right. It can't, and it really is. It has nothing to do with what work we choose to do. And he mentioned that too, right? It's like, it's about going to whatever it is that you do, and it could be your job, and doing it with a new knowledge and wisdom and skillful means that you have, and applying it, openness, right? Not doing it with a set of goals that have to be achieved or you're going to be upset. And So I really appreciate that. I've never forgotten that, and I think it applies to everyone in this room and everyone in the world, right? And the other thing I just wanted to say too, in terms of what you were first talking about with the compassion and the struggling with that idea, the one thing that I feel like I'm always a little biased growing up in the U.S. and reading Western, like just being a Westerner, and compassion and sympathy are not always, they're used interchangeably a lot, maybe erroneously, but they're very similar for a lot of people, and I think that the reason that, to me, and this could be too simplistic of a way of looking at it, but the reason that compassion is so powerful and is sort of omnipresent if we are available to it is because compassion arises, to me, out of the awareness of the interconnectivity of all things, right? And so that, right, so that compassion, it's not that it's not that I sense what somebody else is feeling in that moment. It's that we are interconnected, and I feel what that person is feeling or that being is experiencing. And when you have that kind of knowledge and awareness, it's like, and you also have a knowledge or awareness of how you can affect that. That to me is the basis of compassion, and I feel like that's why it's always there. It sounded like the battery just went dead on that.
And that when we get lost in dreams, daydreams, of dreams of all kinds, we lose that interconnectivity. Mm-hmm. We're not interconnected. We're alone. We're isolated.
You can't have compassion. You can't have real compassion and or act on it without and still think that there's a separation between you and the rest of the world, or you and the person.
And the way you access that connectivity is by coming present, by becoming aware, by developing vipassana, mahavipassana. Yeah, coming present.
Did you have something you wanted to say? Yeah.
I would have been on your side if I was in that high school class with you.
Yeah.
One of the secrets about life is that if you want to be happy, do things for other people. And being compassionate is a path that you can experience from it joy. It's a result of it. One is a condition, the other one is the result, it's the effect. So anytime one does anything for other people, you're going to get a benefit to yourself. That's simply the way that it is. Is there any true altruism? Altruistic actions? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe you were right about that.
I'm so glad to hear that other people now agree with me, because nobody agreed with me in high school.
Well, I would agree with you. But then you could have gone on to say, and pointed out that there's two types of compassion. One is a relative compassion, where you do an act for somebody and you do receive a benefit, whether you're looking for it or not. And if you are looking for it, you may not get the benefit. But there's a quid pro quo there. You can just experience. But the question came, how is something done for other people without this transactional quality about it? And there we get into ultimate bodhicitta, ultimate compassion. And you said there's a difference there. And I think John kind of hit on it a little bit. There certainly is. In these three kayas, or three bodies, we see these appearances, and then we realize that they're momentary appearances, and that these appearances are also dependent. They're not out there by themselves. These appearances are dependent upon our minds or our consciousness, and that they're actually projections of that consciousness. And the projection and the mind are not two things, but they're one thing. And the vipassana is seeing that the arising of these things are none other than ourselves. And again, there's two ways to look at it. That there's one is through prajna paramita. And prajna paramita, you're correct, that once we pointed out that it's a transcendental knowledge, but one could also say it's a transcendental knowledge realizing emptiness, the insubstantiability of all these projections that what they are. It can be looked at from a point of view of no self, which is the emptiness or the prajna point of view, or the view that everything is self. And that when we're doing good for another, it's just a projection of our own mind. It's one thing. It's the third kaya, or the Dharma kaya, which is this just infinite oneness and interconnectionness that you pointed out. So we're actually doing something for ourselves, and the benefit and the action are one and the same thing. There's no separation between them, and that's why we call it spontaneous. And it is spontaneous because there's no thought about it. There's no thought of this and that, me and other, good or bad. It's just done because, as you said, also just reviewing what you said in my mind, that this is just what is. Something else that you said about it that was even better. I can't remember what it was. It was on my mind a second ago.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, bottom line, altruism doesn't exist because you're still helping yourself.
Yeah. So, how is it
by helping everyone else?
Yeah. So it comes down to it's the koan. How does the Bodhisattva save all sentient beings? Because there is no Bodhisattva.
Yeah. I was right in high school. Who knew? No, thank you. That's great. That's a great point. And I love that. The idea that, so if the only way that you can have a bodhisattva, how does a bodhisattva save all other beings if we're all one, if we're all interconnected? There really is not. You're really saving yourself. So it's a little bit of a mind bender, but you could say that we're really super selfish. we just want to help ourselves. This bodhisattva. So funny. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like a kind of a course level bodhisattva, let's say. But even so, we still have to see the benefit in it. So isn't that gross? Isn't that coarse? If you have to see the benefit in even having ulterior motives to help yourself, to help someone else or whatever, because if you don't see the benefit, then nobody's going to do it. No one's going to do it. So even on a very low, gross level of starting on the Bodhisattva path, there's got to be some connection to wanting to work with the world in a different way. There's got to be some kind of revulsion of samsara. Otherwise, it's just never going to happen, no matter what. So, but you have to start somewhere.
I think that where that comes from is the recognition of suffering, right? It's a recognition of being suffering that usually stems from your own recognition of suffering. Sorry, speak up. Is that recognizing when you first recognize your own suffering and where it comes from, and then seeing it around you in the world is I think I don't know if there's another basis for wanting to walk the Bodhisattva path.
When Trungpa Rinpoche was escaping from Tibet, and the Chinese bullets were flying over his head, he made a vow that if he gets out of this alive, he will dedicate his whole life to his students. And he did. That's what he did. But I think that there was kind of some kind of a big wake-up call in Tibet when this was happening, when they had to, the warrings of the different types of Buddhist monasteries and different types of lineages and this and that, all seemed very meaningless when you're like losing everything. And so it comes down to basics. What is really valuable? What is really important? And for instance, Khyentse Rinpoche, he's on the shrine, the second picture from the right. He was a Nyingma teacher, but his practice was Rime. He accepted and studied and practiced all forms of Tibetan Buddhism that he felt was valuable. And I think a lot of teachers, when they left Tibet under such horrific circumstances, became more Rime. That means they accepted all different forms of Buddhism. For instance, like the Dalai Lama, had he been in Tibet, he never would have had such bodhisattva activity the way he has now. And he received teachings from Khyentse Rinpoche, and he received teachings from all the great lamas, because there they all were in India or Nepal, in little, hovels, and not separated from their big monasteries and lots of land between them. And so they began to see that they can somehow understand the pith instructions of the Buddha, and when he taught the Bodhisattva path, that they could take it to heart and really start to work with themselves and others in a very big way. And now, for instance, in our time, this young girl, Greta, from Sweden, she's bringing out a point about the kind of bodhisattva activity that she's doing, was because she's seeing that we're living on a planet that really needs some attention, rather than warring in the little factions of all our different countries. And that's what I think happened to the Tibetan teachers when they made it out alive. Someone like the Dalai Lama, who would never have had any contact with in Tibet. Why are you looking at me like that? When he was in Tibet,
Wouldn't have been a bodhisattva?
no, he was a bodhisattva, but he became much more Rime, more accepting of all aspects of the Dharma, and brought it down to the very pith instructions of the Buddha, where he can talk to anyone. Because he left Tibet, he met a lot of different people, a lot of different teachers, and studied in a way, became a great practitioner in a way that he never would have had access to in Tibet, only because reality changed for them. And I think that's what happens when you step onto the Bodhisattva path. When you begin to see how insignificant all our little pettinesses that we have in this world, and how important it is to really value life and really value each other as a society of human beings, and all sentient beings, really, animals too. So this is the aspiration that we have when we step onto the Bodhisattva path, in its crudest level.
Thank you. So, I think with that, we've gone a little over. So, thank you guys all, we're gonna read Dedication of Merit, which I would actually like a copy of as well. The Dedication of Merit, just so you guys know, if you're new to this, You don't have to read it, but the dedication merit is basically we're trying to, by being here tonight and talking and listening, and just by our presences, we have accumulated some good karma for the world and for ourselves, and we're gonna give it away to make the world a better place. And then by giving it away, we actually get it back. But we're not supposed to talk about that. So. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. May the Buddhist teachings spread and flourish. May all beings have happiness and joy. May the Dharma be practiced continuously day and night. May the benefit of self and others be spontaneously accomplished. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. Thanks, guys. Thank you for being here and contributing and your presence.